I believe everyone knows that petroleum resources are very important for a country to achieve industrial modernization. Although the world is actively promoting the development and utilization of renewable energy in the next 100 years, the development of modern industries in various countries will be inseparable from the development and processing of petroleum resources. As one of the world's largest oil consumers, oil resources play an important role in supporting China's manufacturing and industrial modernization. However, the uneven distribution of oil resources has triggered competition for oil resources in some countries. As early as 1973, Vietnam took advantage of China's lack of control in the South China Sea to illegally exploit oil in the South China Sea. What makes China even more angry is that Vietnam actually used the South China Sea area to be closer to their country's coastline as an excuse to rope in 27 oil companies from the West to jointly exploit oil in the South China Sea area. According to statistics from the Chinese Ministry of Energy, a total of 120 million tons of oil from the South China Sea was stolen during this illegal mining. In today's video, we'll take a closer look at this historic event in the South China Sea. And what actions did China ultimately take in response to Vietnam's illegal oil mining in the South China Sea? Before getting into the topic, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the Asia Rising Star channel, which will ensure that you don't miss any of our exciting content. Let's get started now. In fact, China's claims to the South China Sea can be traced back to the early 20th century. In accordance with the principles of international law, China believes that the South China Sea islands and their adjacent waters are China's inherent territory and jurisdiction. It was not until 1958 that the Chinese government promulgated the Law of the People's Republic of China on the baselines of the territorial sea in the contiguous zone, which determined the baseline of China's territorial waters in the South China Sea and declared the South China Sea islands and adjacent waters to be Chinese territory. According to surveys by geologists from China and other countries, they all believe that there are at least 250 oil and gas fields in the South China Sea, including possibly 12 large oil and gas fields, with potential oil reserves reaching 29.19 billion tons. In addition to oil resources, the natural gas reserves in this sea area have reached nearly 58 trillion cubic meters, with a total of more than 70 billion tons of oil and gas. If all the oil resources here are developed, it will bring a value of about 2.1 trillion US dollars to the mining countries. Therefore, the South China Sea is also known as the last oil gold zone in the world. However, the huge commercial value brought by the rich resources will inevitably cause other nearby countries to covet it, and Vietnam is one of them. At the same time, Vietnam is also continuing to explore for oil and natural gas in the South China Sea in the hope of obtaining more benefits. Although Vietnam does not have the technical strength to exploit oil resources, after Vietnam discovered industrial oil fields in the South China Sea, Vietnam quickly reached a cooperation agreement with Japan in the development of oil and gas resources in the South China Sea in the 1970s. In order to expand the illegal theft of oil in the South China Sea, Vietnam also roped in 27 Western oil companies to bid for oil exploration concessions in the South China Sea. Since then, Vietnam has signed more than 60 oil and gas exploration and development contracts in the South China Sea with oil companies from Western countries. Interestingly, in order to gain support from more countries, the Vietnamese government has ceded profits to Western companies involved in illegal oil mining in the South China Sea. It is understood that Vietnam has ceded 80% of its South China Sea oil interests to foreign companies. Vietnamese companies can only obtain a smaller part of the South China Sea oil interests. For China, this kind of violation of China's sovereignty will never be allowed. Against this background, the Xishan Naval War broke out between China and Vietnam in 1974. Ultimately, the battle ended with China's victory. Not only that, China also successfully recaptured Coral Islands and other islands that were occupied by Vietnam. Although China declared its sovereignty over the South China Sea to Vietnam through war, Vietnam's ambition to seize oil in the South China Sea has not stopped. Over the years, Vietnam has stolen 120 million tons of oil and 1.5 trillion cubic meters of natural gas in the South China Sea alone. If all these energy sources were sold, the revenue would be more than $25 billion. In order to prevent oil from being stolen in the South China Sea, China has strengthened military patrols in the South China Sea and curbed Vietnam's illegal exploitation. In addition to using military means, the Chinese government has also adopted internationally advocated legal means to safeguard its own rights and interests. In 2012, China promulgated the regulations on the protection of the territory of the South China Sea Islands and their affiliated sea areas, which clearly stipulates that the South China Sea Islands and their affiliated sea areas are China's inherent territory and jurisdiction. At present, this regulation has become the consensus of most countries in the world. More importantly, China by no means just wants to take the resources in the South China Sea as its own. In order to safeguard the fairness of interests in the South China Sea region, China has signed agreements with other countries to jointly develop South China Sea resources. Under such circumstances, many countries are gradually willing to recognize China's sovereignty over the South China Sea and engage in more peaceful and orderly cooperation with China. In contrast, Vietnam's exploitation practices in the South China Sea have triggered widespread controversy in the international community. Therefore, many countries have chosen to take the initiative to terminate their contracts with Vietnam and withdraw from cooperation in stealing oil. Under pressure from many aspects, Vietnam also feels that stealing oil is not worth the gain. So we proactively made proposals to some countries to terminate the contracts. After years of hard work, Vietnam has significantly reduced its piracy of oil in South China since 2012. In 2018, China and Vietnam reached an agreement on the South China Sea, which clearly stipulates that both parties will abide by the principles of international law and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Peace and stability in the South China Sea have been further consolidated. With the failure of oil theft in the South China Sea, Vietnam has also begun to pay the price for its theft. Although China will not further hold Vietnam accountable, this does not mean that they can evade international legal sanctions. In fact, Vietnam has signed cooperative mining agreements with other countries. If it fails to complete these agreements as required, Vietnam will need to pay high liquidated damages. According to public information, Vietnam has paid nearly $1.2 billion in liquidated damages to former cooperative companies. This is a number that cannot be ignored. Because cooperative companies have invested a lot of manpower and material resources in illegal oil mining projects, these companies will naturally not give up on holding Vietnam responsible for the losses caused to them. Not only that, Vietnam had also invested a lot of resources in stealing oil before, but as the illegal oil mining projects were canceled, these investments could only be ruthlessly wasted.